There is a version of you that you have not yet become. Not a better version in the sense of more successful or more admired or more comfortable. A more complete version. The one that contains not just the qualities you have cultivated and the identity you have built, but also the parts you pushed into the shadow, the mask you built to face the world, the grief you haven't finished feeling, and the gifts you haven't fully claimed. Carl Jung called the process of becoming that person individuation, and he considered it the central task of a human life. Not the most urgent task, not the most visible one, the most important one, the one that everything else, the career, the relationships, the achievements, the failures, is either serving or obscuring. This is part 3 of our Jung series. We have explored the shadow, the parts of yourself you buried. We have explored the persona, the mask you built to replace them. Tonight we look at where both of those journeys are pointing, at the destination that has no final arrival. At the process Jung considered the most difficult and the most worthwhile thing a human being can undertake: individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming yourself. The word individuation comes from the Latin individuus, meaning undivided, indivisible, which is immediately interesting given that Jung used it to describe a process of integration, of bringing divided parts of the psyche into relationship with each other. The undivided self is not the starting point. It is the destination, the self that most people live as is already divided, split between what is conscious and what is not, between what is shown and what is hidden, between the person they were shaped to be and the person they actually are underneath the shaping. Individuation is the slow, lifelong, never completed process of reducing that division, of bringing what is unconscious into consciousness, of loosening the grip of the persona enough that the self underneath can breathe, of integrating the shadow rather than projecting it, of becoming, gradually and imperfectly, more whole. Jung was explicit that this is not a project for the first half of life. The first half of life has its own tasks: establishing yourself in the world, building an identity, developing a career and relationships, proving yourself capable of functioning as an adult in society. These tasks require the persona. They require a certain degree of suppression of the more inconvenient parts of yourself. They are not failures. They are necessary. But Jung observed that something often happens in the middle of life, roughly between 35 and 50, that creates the conditions for individuation to begin in earnest. A crisis, a depression, a sudden loss of meaning in things that previously provided it. The career that was so important starts to feel hollow. The identity that was so carefully constructed starts to feel like a costume. The life that looked correct from the outside starts to feel, from the inside, like someone else's. Jung called this the midlife crisis long before the term became cultural shorthand for sports cars and younger partners. But he understood it as something more significant than a moment of weakness or vanity. He understood it as a summons, the psyche, the deeper self, demanding to be heard after decades of being managed and suppressed in service of the first half of life's requirements. The person who responds to this summons by doubling down on the first half of life's strategies, working harder, achieving more, acquiring more, building a bigger version of the same identity, misses what is being asked of them. The crisis is not a problem to be solved by the same tools that created it. It is an invitation to a different kind of project entirely. Individuation does not have to wait for midlife. Jung's framework applies to anyone at any age who has reached the point where the constructed self, the identity built in response to external requirement, feels insufficient, where the gap between who you are performing and who you actually are has become too wide to maintain comfortably, where something underneath the surface is asking, with increasing insistence, to be heard. That asking is the beginning, not the crisis itself. The willingness to hear it. Jung mapped the territory of individuation through a series of archetypes: the shadow, the persona, the anima and animus, and finally the self. Each one represents a stage in the process of integration. Each one, encountered and worked with honestly, moves the person further along the journey toward wholeness. We have covered the shadow and the persona in previous videos. The shadow is what you pushed into the unconscious, the qualities deemed unacceptable, the feelings too threatening to acknowledge, the aspects of yourself that the world around you could not accommodate. The persona is what you built on top, the curated presentation of self that eventually risks replacing the self it was meant to represent. The first moves of individuation are shadow work and persona work, the recognition of what has been buried and what has been performed, the beginning of an honest relationship with both. This is the work most people mean when they talk about shadow work in the popular sense. It is real and it is necessary, but it is only the beginning of what Jung was describing. The next stage involves what Jung called the anima and animus, the inner feminine in a man's psychology, and the inner masculine in a woman's, though Jung's framework here is better understood as the contrasexual element in any psyche rather than a strict gender binary. The qualities that are associated with the opposite of however you have been socialized to present. A man who has been raised to be strong, rational, and emotionally self-sufficient carries in his unconscious a capacity for feeling, receptivity, and connection that his conscious identity has not integrated. That capacity, the anima, tends to be projected onto women, experienced as the mysterious and overwhelming quality of romantic love, and lived indirectly rather than owned. Integrating the anima means bringing those qualities into conscious relationship, not becoming them, but acknowledging them as genuinely his own, rather than something that exists only outside him. The same dynamic operates in reverse. The point in both cases is the same. The qualities you have pushed out of your conscious identity because they didn't fit the role you were asked to play are still there. They are influencing you from the unconscious. The work of individuation is to bring them back into awareness where they can be worked with, rather than simply acted out through projection and compulsion. The destination of the individuation process, never reached, only approached, is what Jung called the self, capitalized to distinguish it from the everyday ego self. The self is not the conscious personality. It is the whole of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, shadow and persona, all the archetypes and all the complexes and all the buried history, oriented around a deeper center that Jung believed was the true source of psychological health and meaning. The self, in Jung's framework, is what you are when you stop insisting on only being the part of yourself that is acceptable. When the conscious ego, the identity you have built and defended, becomes permeable enough to allow the rest of the psyche into relationship with it. Not dissolving the ego, but relativizing it. Recognizing that it is not the whole of what you are, that there is something deeper and larger that it is serving, or that it is blocking, depending on how rigid and defended it has become. Individuation is not a linear process. It does not have clear stages that complete in sequence and stay completed. It is more like a spiral, returning to the same themes and the same wounds and the same patterns again and again, each time from a slightly different angle and with slightly more awareness than the last time. The same old anger, the same old fear, the same old tendency to perform rather than be. But each time a little more visible, a little more integrated, a little less able to run your life from the shadows where you cannot see it. This is why Jung was suspicious of people who claimed to have finished their psychological work, who presented themselves as fully integrated, shadow-free, authentically themselves with no further work required. The claim itself was a signal. The persona does not disappear when you become conscious of it. It becomes a more sophisticated persona. The shadow does not empty when you begin doing shadow work. It reveals new layers. The journey of becoming yourself does not arrive at a destination. It deepens. What it looks like in practice is less dramatic than the theoretical framework suggests. It looks like the gradual expansion of what you can tolerate knowing about yourself. The slowly increasing capacity to sit with your own contradictions, to be the person who contains both the quality you are proud of and the quality you are ashamed of, without needing to resolve the contradiction by denying one of them. It looks like the slow loosening of the need for the persona to be completely convincing, the growing ability to let people see more of you than is strategically optimal, the relationships that become possible when you stop editing yourself so heavily, not because you have no filter, but because the filter has become more permeable, more genuinely yours rather than the fear-driven automatic suppression of everything that might not be well received. It looks like the reactions that used to hijack you losing some of their power, not because you no longer feel them, but because you can see them coming, can name what they are, can choose your response rather than being swept away by the trigger. The space between stimulus and response, which Frankl described and Marcus Aurelius practiced, widening gradually as more of what was unconscious becomes visible. Jung spent the last years of his life building a stone tower by a lake in Bollingen, Switzerland. He built it with his own hands, slowly, across decades, adding rooms as different aspects of his psychology demanded expression. He described it as a place where he could be what he was without performance or explanation, where the various layers of himself could coexist without the pressure of social presentation. It was, in concrete form, the image of individuation, a structure that grew over time to accommodate more and more of the person who built it. Not finished, not perfect, but genuinely his. The version of you that you haven't yet become is not waiting in some distant future contingent on the right circumstances arriving. It is available now, in the specific work of seeing more clearly what you are already carrying, in the willingness to look at what you have pushed into the dark and bring it back into the light where it can be integrated rather than projected, in the gradual, imperfect, never-finished practice of becoming less divided. Jung called it individuation because the goal is the undivided self. Not perfect, not finished, not free of shadow or persona or the ordinary human mess of contradiction and limitation. Just genuinely, recognizably, increasingly yours. The journey does not end, but it is the only journey that is actually going somewhere.